Now we're going with Jill Raymond, who is a reactivated web weaver and WDI activist, and she will tell us about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. So thank you very much, Jill, and over to you.
I just introduced this report by reminding everyone that in 2006, Julie Bindel wrote her first article about grooming gangs in northern towns, naming the ethnicity of these gangs. The Sunday Times, The Independent, and The Guardian would not print her articles on the grounds of the danger of inflaming racial tensions in those towns. In 2007, Julie was put on the Islamophobic list by the left. The press silenced her, and many white feminists did not support her. Maggie Oliver is a former Greater Manchester detective constable who resigned in 2012 in order to expose the Rochdale gangs. In 2019, she established the Maggie Oliver Foundation, which supports victims and survivors. Holly Archer is now 38. For 4 years, from the age of 14, she was abused and raped by criminal gangs in Telford. Years later, in 2022, the Crowther inquiry and report revealed police failings. Holly had campaigned for 7 years for this inquiry. She now runs her Holly Project support organisation for survivors, which is backed by Telford and Wrekin Council. In 2015, Dr. Alex Jay began a 7-year statutory independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, ICSA. It cost £186 million to produce a 458-page report, which was published in October 2022. More than 7,000 victims took part in it. I will now be reading verbatim from the report. This is the executive summary introduction from Dr. Alexis J. This report is the final statutory report published by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, the inquiry. In accordance with the terms of references, it sets out the main findings about the extent to which state and non-state institutions failed in their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation, and makes recommendations for reform. It draws on the inquiry's 15 investigations and 19 related investigation reports, including the interim report of the ICSA, and 41 other inquiry reports and publications. The inquiry has made 20 recommendations in this report. These final recommendations complement the 87 recommendations contained in the previously published investigation reports, including 6 which have been restated. There's a few more statistics. There are nearly 13 million children in England and Wales, each of whom needs and deserves to be protected from harm. Babies, toddlers, and children are potentially at risk, with current estimates indicating that 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 20 boys experience child sexual abuse before the age of 16. In March 2020, the Office for National Statistics estimated that 3.1 million adults in England and Wales had experienced sexual abuse before the age of 16. Reflecting the guiding principles that the child's welfare is paramount, the inquiry's recommendations are focused on making England and Wales places for children to grow up safely and thrive. I'm not going to read these next points out. It summarises the work of the inquiry over the past 7 years, and it demonstrates these list of things which the other speakers have already covered really clearly. So I will move on, but there's a little summary on the screen there of the same sort of things. I think I'll just reiterate that the final point is that this is not just a national crisis, but a global one. At the heart of this report are the inquiry's recommendations to help protect children. There needs to be greater priority and focus politically and across society as a whole on protecting children from sexual abuse. The establishment of the child protection authorities in England and Wales, coupled with national public awareness campaigns, are designed to ensure that the spotlight remains directly at preventing child sexual abuse. These recommendations will be reinforced by cabinet-level ministerial positions for children to provide senior leadership and increased priority within government. One of the aims of the public awareness campaign is to inform the public about the action they should take if they know or suspect a child is being sexually abused. This will complement the recommendation for a new law of mandatory reporting, making it a legal requirement for those who work in regulated activity or work in a position of trust to report child sexual abuse. The impact of past failures to protect children from sexual abuse and to support those who have been harmed is incalculable. To address this, the inquiry considers that a redress scheme must be established to make some reparations for the harm suffered. Background and context. The sexual abuse and exploitation of children is criminal and morally wrong. There is no excuse for those who perpetrate this crime. It has never been right or excusable whenever it has occurred. To a significant extent, this also applies to those who knew about the abuse but did nothing, as well as to those who actively covered it up or contrived to assist a perpetrator or from escaping justice or avoiding the scrutiny of statutory authorities. The extent of the global crisis in child sexual abuse and exploitation is manifest by the number of national and international institutional inquiries across the world, including the USA, Australia, Ireland, Germany, France, Spain, and Japan. In surveys, girls were at least 3 times as likely as boys to describe experiences of child sexual abuse. Disabled participants were twice as likely to describe such experiences as non-disabled participants. And those who lived in care home were nearly 4 times as likely to have experienced child sexual abuse. Those who had experienced childhood neglect were nearly 5 times as likely to have experienced child sexual abuse as those who had not. The inquiry also conducted a thematic investigation into child protection in religious organisations and settings. In total, 38 religious organisations, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, new religious movements, non-conformist Christian denominations, non-Trinitarian Christian dominations, paganism, and Sikhism, provided evidence to the inquiry. Respect for a diversity of beliefs is the hallmark of a liberal democracy, but can never be used to justify harm to a child. There were significant barriers to effective reporting of child sexual abuse, including victim blaming and the notion of shame and honour. In some religious traditions and communities, children are not taught about sex or sexual relationships. The inquiry was told by representatives of some faiths that in some languages there were no words for rape, sexual abuse, or genitalia. The victims' and survivors' voices uses the words of those who have been sexually abused to describe what happened to them. Some of the content is therefore explicit, but these experiences and perspectives are at the heart of this inquiry. Each account represents a life fundamentally altered and affected by the abuse. The harm brought about by sexual abuse cannot be overstated or ignored. Educational, familial relationships, sexual relationships, mental, emotional, and physical well-being, job prospects can all be affected. In some cases, it has driven victims to self-harm and even to take their own lives. It is difficult to imagine what it feels like to be silenced or dismissed when trying to tell someone that you have been sexually abused. This happens so often to victims and survivors that many gave up trying to report what had happened to them. That is why the Truth Project, designed to enable victims and survivors to share their accounts in a confidential setting, was such a vital part of the inquiry's work, and why Victims and Survivors' Voices represents a cornerstone of the inquiry's analysis and recommendations. More than 6,200 victims and survivors contributed to the Truth Project. For some, it was the first time they had ever spoken about the child sexual abuse they had suffered. Across the inquiry's work, victims and survivors recounted the barriers they faced when reporting abuse. Many felt a deep sense of shame about what had been done to them. They worried about the consequences of reporting abuse. Some victims and survivors were too young at the time of the abuse to recognize what was happening to them, or that it was abusive. Some did not have the vocabulary to describe that abuse. Accounts revealed how sexual abuse was often accompanied by physical abuse or neglect at home. Many of the acts perpetrated caused agonizing physical pain. Most inflicted by abusers who was known to the victim and who they trusted. The inquiry heard how it was difficult for many victims and survivors to report what was happening to them and how they were ignored or not taken seriously. Many victims and survivors who contributed to the inquiry's work were motivated to share their accounts in order to try to help other children being abused. As a result, this report starts with the victims and survivors. As well as contributions made to public hearings, victims and survivors assisted the inquiry through the Victim Survivor Consultative Panel and the Victims and Survivors Forum. Engagement was enhanced by discussion with young people, the LGBTQI+ communities, and specialist organisations assisting victims of child sexual abuse from ethnic minority communities. Each group describes particular concerns, but common themes emerged that were reflected throughout the inquiry's work. Lack of trust in institutions that were supposed to help, and a failure to respond appropriately to the impact of sexual abuse, as well as the cultural and other related issues. Victims and survivors' voices used the words of those who have been sexually abused to describe what happened to them. Some of the content is therefore explicit, but these experiences and perspectives are at the heart of this inquiry. These are from Part B of the report, and it's titled, Why I Choose to Share My Experience. I want to somehow represent people that didn't have a voice, that weren't considered. I want to protect people that it potentially could happen to in the future. That was from a participant of the residential schools investigation. Alf said, I just wanted to get my story out, to illustrate how violence and sexual abuse can affect a child and what to look out for. Lisa is deaf and came to the Truth Project because she wanted to be listened to and believed. Holly said, I can now say I'm finally being heard and can grieve for the person I might have been if I had not been a victim of child abuse. I'm 65, and the Truth Project is the first support I've had in my whole life where I can actually tell a story. So I've waited a very long time for this. That was from a participant from the Ethnic Minority Communities Research. Janine said, I'm doing this for my 5-year-old me. From the age of 6, Humara was sexually abused, including being raped by her older brother. She believed her parents knew about the abuse because they eventually sent him away to live with a relative. Ashley thought it was a disclosure of a previous sexual abuse which made her choir master decide to exploit her vulnerability. And finally, Lionel explained that he did not want being sexually abused as a child to define him. He felt it was possible for victims and survivors to overcome child sexual abuse.